I'm John Greenwood, and it's great to be back among all you social ontologists. And I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to present my paper along with all my other fellow social ontologists. It's also a great pleasure to be back at the University of San Diego, University of California, San Diego, even if it is virtually. And I get this going. I would say that it brings back fond memories of the first time I came here many moons ago for a history of psychology conference, in which I presented my first paper on the mark of the social, which had great response and got me on that track. It was memorable for another reason, namely that on the way over, on the flight over, someone spilled coffee on my white shirt and khakis. And my luggage was lost or delayed, whatever, on the way to San Diego. So since I was giving a paper the next morning, I had to go to the only shop on campus that had any items of clothing, and I bought a San Diego, UC San Diego t-shirt, pants, socks, underwear, and so on, in which I presented my paper the next day. I still treasure these items which bring me fond memory. Okay, Durkheim is well known to historians and philosophers of social science as a paradigmatic ontological holist, who maintain that social groups or collectives exist in some sense over and above or distinct from collections of individuals. Okay, so here's a statement of ontological holism. Social facts differ not only in quality from psychical facts, they have a different substratum. They do not evolve in the same environment or depend on the same conditions. This does not mean that they are not in some sense psychical, since they all consist of ways of thinking and acting. But the states of the collective consciousness are of a different nature than the states of the individual consciousness. They are representations of another kind. The mentality of groups is not that of individuals, it has its own laws. Now, in justification of this claim, Durkheim appealed to a supposed parallel between living cells and social groups. So as he says, it is indeed certain that in the living cell there are only molecules of crude matter, but they are an association, and it is this association which is the cause of the new phenomena which characterizes life, even the germ of which it is impossible to find in a single one of these associated elements. This is because the whole does not equal the sum of its parts, that famous phrase. It is something different, whose properties differ from those displayed by the parts from which it is formed. By virtue of this principle, society is not the mere sum of individuals, but a system formed by its association represents a specific reality which has its own characteristics. By aggregating together, by interpenetrating, by fusing together, and all these other metaphors, individuals give birth to a being, psychical if you will, but one which constitutes a psychic individuality of a new kind. Thus, it is in the nature of this individuality, and not in its component elements, that we must search for the proximate and determining causes of the facts produced by it. The group thinks, feels, and acts differently from the way its members would if they were isolated. If therefore we begin by studying these members separately, we will understand nothing about what is taking place in the group. Now, these last two sentences are somewhat misleading and ambiguous. You get the same sentences repeated in William Dougal's The Social Mind and also in Gabriel Tard's treatise on the crowd. When Tard talks about this distinction between feeling, acting, and thinking in isolation, he's contrasting persons thinking, feeling, and acting in physical isolation from other persons. So, for example, if you're in the waiting room at the dentist by yourself, you might be a little bit anxious. But if there's other people in the waiting room who are also anxious, you'll get more anxious as a result. That kind of sense, and people lose their minds in crowds and so on, and can't get emotional and stuff like that. That's not what Durkheim or McDougall meant. They meant there's a distinction between individuals in isolation in the sense of isolated from a system of relations that make them members of groups. They behave differently. Okay. Now, the first paragraph's pretty much the same again, so I won't read it all, but again, the living cell contains nothing save chemical particles, just as society is made up of nothing except individuals. It is very clearly impossible for the characteristic phenomena of life to reside in atoms of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. Let us apply this principle to sociology. If, as is granted to us, the synthesis sui generis, which constitutes every society, gives rise to new phenomena, different from those which occur in consciousness in isolation, same ambiguity, one is forced to admit that these specific facts reside in the society itself that produces them and not in its parts, namely its members. In this sense, therefore, they lie outside the consciousness of individuals as such, in much the same way as the distinctive features of life lie outside the chemical substances that make up a living organism. Okay, and before we move on, a couple of points to make about this. When Durkheim talks about society, sometimes he means society in general, but oftentimes he just refers to individual social groups such as Protestants, trade unionists, and the like. And that's the way the term was commonly used in the 19th century. Speaking of the 19th century, this view of Durkheim's that somehow, you know, the phenomena of life, physiological phenomena are somehow over and above the physics and chemistry that underlie them, wasn't a universally held view. This was not common sense or commonly accepted in the 19th century. Au contraire, those pioneers of experimental physiology in the 19th century, such as Ernst Bruch, Emile Durkheim, Helmholtz, a whole slew of others, actually took a blood oath in 1845. They were members of the Berlin Physical Society, in which they swore never to recognize no other forces in the organism other than the known physico-chemical ones, as they thought that all physiological processes could be entirely reduced to physico-chemical ones. Of course, one of the reasons for that was they were afraid of vitalism if they accepted life as over and above physico-chemical processes. All right. So then the question is, why does Durkheim lay such a great emphasis on this stuff? Okay. Well, the reason is, I think, that because what he's doing is he's trying to determine the subject matter of sociology, distinct from psychology on the one hand and physiology on the other hand. Now, remember, in the 19th century, experimental physiology was one of the great achievements of science. And later on in the 19th century, experimental psychology was born by appropriating the experimental methods of physiology and applying them to psychology. This Wundt psychology was called physiological psychology, not because it reduced psychology to physiology, but because it appropriated the experimental methods of physiology. Okay, and at the beginning of Rules of Sociological Method, Durkheim's considering the question, well, what are the distinctive features of social facts that makes them what they are? And he considers the idea that they're general in society, which they are, of course. But he says that cannot be the distinguishing feature of social facts, because, of course, physiological facts are general in society. Psychological facts are general in society. You know, most of us are rational, emotional, and so on. Most of us do all the physiological stuff. Okay. So he had to appeal to things like independent of consciousness, and they exert some coercive force upon us. All right. Whatever exactly the reason, Durkheim's apparent commitment to a radical discontinuity between the subject matters of sociology and psychology also explains how many have treated Durkheim as a dogmatic explanatory holist, who held that social phenomena could only be explained in terms of social facts. So here's his explanatory holism, and this famous passage occurs at the end of the first set of passages that I put up above. In a word, there is between psychology and sociology the same break in continuity as there is between biology and the physical and chemical sciences. Consequently, every time a social phenomenon is directly explained by a psychological phenomenon, we may be sure the explanation is false. That's my emphasis. And I call this last claim Durkheim's dogma. Well, it certainly sounds dogmatic, but in the rest of this talk, I want to suggest that it's only apparently dogmatic, and that Durkheim was not opposed to psychological explanation of social phenomena per se, but only to a particular form of psychological explanation. With respect to social and psychological explanation, Durkheim claimed, I have never said that sociology contains nothing that is psychological, and I fully accept that it is a psychology, but distinct from individual psychology. Okay, I think I can come out now. Come back and see you all. All right, here we go. So all Durkheim seems to have meant in claiming that the mentality of groups is not that of individuals, it has its own laws, is that the principles of psychology governing the psychology and behavior that are a function, as he put it, of the way in which individuals associating together are formed in groups are likely distinct from the principles of psychology governing the psychology and behavior that are not. Alternatively put, and perhaps better put, these forms of acting, feeling, and thinking that are socially engaged, that are orientated towards the forms of acting, feeling, and thinking of members of social groups, are different than those forms of acting, feeling, and thinking that are individually engaged, for reasons or causes independent of an individual's orientation to the forms of acting, feeling, and thinking of members of social groups. Now, this was an eminently reasonable claim for Durkheim to make. It seems reasonable to suppose, for example, that some of our attitudes towards abortion, aggression, and commitments to nationalization of some industries are socially engaged, that they're formed, at least in part, through a social affiliation with fellow Catholics, gang members, and socialists. In contrast to individually engaged attitudes towards abortion, based solely on arguments against abortion, aggression driven by personal motives of revenge, and commitments towards the nationalization of industry is brought about by manipulative brainwashing. Or to give you an individual example of the distinction between social psychological explanations and individual psychological explanations, one might say that Catholics' belief that abortion is wrong is socially held. It is held because and on condition that he or she represents other Catholics as holding that belief. If it's normatively orientated to the beliefs of other Catholics, of what you believe in. In contrast, a Catholic's belief that abortion is wrong may be said to be individually held if it's held on the basis of consideration of arguments or evidence, or if it's been beaten into them as a child by parents, guardians, or teachers, or whoever. Now, this would appear to be the distinction that Durkheim was making when he maintained that sociology was not distinct from psychology, but was a different form of psychology, namely collective or social psychology. While he recognized that many sociological explanations are social psychological explanations, he claimed that such explanations do not reduce to individual psychological explanations, or at least could not be presumed to do so. As he put it, one has no right to treat collective, that is social psychology, as an extension, an enlargement, or a new illustration of individual psychology. Moreover, in making these claims, Durkheim was not only being non-dogmatic, he was making the critical point that whether or not social explanations do reduce to individual psychological explanations, is an empirical question to be determined by sociological and psychological science, not by philosophical fiat. So to consider two examples from two social statistical examples of the kind he gives in On Suicide, we say that the best explanation of the differential suicide rates between Protestants and Catholics may best be explained in terms of socially engaged beliefs about the morality of suicide held socially by Protestants and Catholics. Whereas the differences between the suicide rates between the employed and the unemployed may be in terms of different rates of depression between the employed and the unemployed. So finally, Durkheim's oft-quoted pronouncement that when a psychological explanation of a social phenomenon is offered, we may be sure that it's false, can be interpreted not as a dogmatic statement, but as a reasonable prediction about the explanatory potential of the individualistic association psychology of his own day. Durkheim actually allowed that social explanations might ultimately reduce to individual psychological explanations, but insisted that the question could not be answered until an adequate social psychology was developed, which was not the case in his own day. So, as he put it, social psychology, whose task it should be to determine them, is hardly more than a term which covers all kinds of general questions, various and imprecise, without any defined object. Whether the situation has changed in our own century remains an interesting and open question about which I've got a lot to say, but I will not say it here, although I'd be pleased to answer any questions about it. But here at the end, I hope to have at least convinced you that Durkheim wasn't a dogmatist about sociological explanation. Thank you all.